Thank you so much to Angela and Alfonsina for having me and for all your work in putting together this virtual webinar. It's been so wonderful to hear all the other papers and see how many people are thinking about dance and movement in the ancient world. This paper is a selection of part of my master's thesis from North Carolina State University, which I completed last spring. I'm currently in my first year of a PhD program in Ancient Near Eastern Art and Archaeology, University of California, Berkeley. So this is all you'll see, somewhat preliminary work, but I'm excited to share it with you all. This paper is partly a theoretical discussion, which tries to work through how we can think about acrobatic movement, and also partly a case study. So I want to give you just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to start with a pretty broad theoretical discussion of acrobatic performance and the kinds of issues it gives us really unique access to. I'm next going to talk through both textual and visual evidence for a particular category of acrobatic professional in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. And I'll argue that these professionals sometimes performed a particular type of acrobatics that involved tumbling over upright swords. And then I'm going to circle back around to some of the broader issues I raised and try to think about how they inform our understanding of these Near Eastern acrobats. Before I do that, I want to mention that I spent several years working professionally teaching and performing acrobatics. So that experience has really shaped the way I understand the significance of the performing body and our perceptions of the physical abilities of the body. I want to start with a quick description of acrobatics, which
Rachel,
yes.
Sorry, just to make sure that we are following you. If you are going up and down, back and forth with the PowerPoint, we are still at the first slides. Is it right?
Yep, that's okay. That's right. There's nothing else.
Okay.
But soon there will be.
Sorry.
No worries. No problem. I'm going to start with a quick definition of acrobatics, which I define as unusual movements of the body requiring extreme physical ability. So acrobatics, by definition, then, is a type of movement that explores the extreme end of human abilities. And through acrobatic movement, ideas about the body and the body's abilities are worked out. What follows is that the performance of acrobatic movement is then a space in which these ideas are presented and consumed and experienced by an audience. These two components of acrobatics, extreme movement on the one hand and performance on the other, are both really central to why this is such a unique and useful area of investigation. Extreme movement gets us at ideas about the body. It opens up questions such as what are the limits of physical ability, who is able to approach those limits, and really what did different people expect their bodies and the bodies of others to be able to do. It also opens up questions into how the body experiences the world. How does someone's internal sense of their body's capabilities affect their perception of events? And then the second aspect is performance, which tells us to ask questions like how were these ideas about the body communicated? And how is the body a sort of flexible tool that's capable of sending messages through movement? And how is movement of the body something that's read and experienced by other people? These two facets of performance, movement and messaging, are central to how I understand the significance of acrobatic performance. There are two kind of broad theoretical perspectives I think we should take when approaching acrobatic performance. The first is a semiotic approach that examines how meaning is created by particular movements and shapes of the body. And the other is a kinesthetic phenomenological approach, which tries to explore how people felt within their own bodies. In terms of semiotics, because acrobatic performances use the body so explicitly and deliberately, we should understand the body as a tool for creating meaning in these performances. This is something that can apply to many types of movement, but the body in acrobatic performance is worth some special consideration because in these performances, the body and the physical abilities of the body are the explicit focus. So for example, we might pay attention to things like how the acrobats choose to exaggerate, expose, or conceal either their exertion or the degree of danger that they're in. A phenomenological perspective is useful in thinking about how this movement was experienced. This is something that applies to both the performers, their sense of their own abilities and movement, as well as the often physical and visceral experience of an audience watching acrobatics. That said, I want to think about these two approaches as very intertwined. The movements and shapes of the body can't be considered separately from the feelings that they give rise to. Also, because the audience is one of the necessary components of acrobatic performance, we can't consider performers in isolation. Acrobats are both experiencing their own performance as well as being experienced by the audience, who have their own identities that might be brought to bear on these performances. The last thing I want to add before I move on to my case study is that acrobatics is a useful analytical category, but not necessarily a category that would have been meaningful to all people at all times or in all places. As a case study, I want to look at professional acrobatic performers in Bronze Age Mesopotamia and Anatolia. There's very little evidence, so I've pulled from a fairly wide geographic and chronological span. I'm looking particularly at material from Ebla and Nagar, which Nagar is Tel Brak on this map. That material dates to the late 3rd millennium BCE, as well as from Mari and Hittite Anatolia. This material dates to around the mid-2nd millennium. I have these indicated on the map, although the Hittite sites are a little bit further into Turkey than the map shows. There are two sorts of components to my argument. First, that several pieces of artistic evidence correspond with written descriptions of acrobatic professionals found in a variety of cuneiform texts, primarily in the Ebla and Mari archives, as well as a few Hittite texts. These texts describe male professional performers who perform a tumbling sort of motion at festivals and feasts. These performers are referred to using either the Sumerogram huptu, or phonetically they're written out in Akkadian as hupu. The second component is that at least some of these professional acrobats perform a particular sort of gymnastic tumbling in which for either a part or entirety of their performance, they tumble over upright swords. One text from Mari really gives us a sense of this movement. It describes it using the word nabalkutu. This word has a connotation of a very physical inverting sort of motion. It's also used to describe the rolling of waves, a bird tumbling through the air, a boat capsizing, etc. This is what really gives us a sense that these performances involved inversion, that is a head over heels kind of movement, or what we would maybe think of today as a kind of gymnastics sort of tumbling. All of these texts also place the performances at feasts and at festivals. The second component is that at least some of these professional acrobats perform a particular sort of gymnastic tumbling in which for either a part or the entirety of their performance, they tumble over upright swords. Sword tumbling is a type of acrobatic performance that's fairly well known from ancient Greece. They're mentioned in many texts, including by Xenophon and Plato. They show up in visual culture as well. I have a few images up just to give you a sense of what that looked like, to show a performer kind of in the middle of the performance. They're bending backwards over the sword. And then in the bottom right, you see an image of a girl, and she's approaching a set of swords stuck upright in the ground. You can really see clearly that those are swords there. And in the Greek world, these acts seem to be performed almost entirely by women at symposiums. This isn't to say that there's any continuity of tradition here. There's also some evidence for sword tumbling later in the medieval period, just that it's an attested type of acrobatic performance. It's also not to say that necessarily all instances of these hupu performers were performing sword tumbling. Seems very possible that, a lot like how we use the word acrobat today, it could be a fairly broad term, and the people who fall under it might have performed a really wide range of different activities. There we go. I have up on the slides two objects, which I'm going to suggest show sword tumbling. The first is a drawing of a mid-24th century seal impression from Tel Brak, ancient Nagar, which you can see on the bottom left. And the second is a mid-16th century, which I have shown as both a line drawing and the original vase. Both of these objects have figures on them that have previously been identified as acrobats, but I'd like to connect these figures to the acrobats discussed in texts, and also argue that they are specifically depicting sword tumbling. The Nagar seal is particularly useful in drawing a connection to the textual descriptions of acrobats, because contemporary texts from Ebla record hupu acrobats traveling to Ebla from Nagar, both to perform and also to train new acrobats at Ebla. So it seems from these texts that Nagar was known as a city that produced these specialists, at least around the mid to late 3rd millennium. Also, in both the Tel Brak seal and the Hittite vase, the context of the performances involves feasting, which matches up with the textual descriptions of these figures. In terms of identifying these as sword tumblers, I want to really focus on this Hittite vase. So on the vase in the second register down, we see two sword bearers whose swords stick up into the register above. You see them right there. This is especially interesting because it's unusual in Hittite art. There are 4 known bases of this style, and in only one other instance is there an element which extends out of its register. I have a drawing of this up. In this case, it's a wagon in the top register right there. And its extension out of the register follows a sort of spatial logic. This vase also has an almost identical set of sword bearers. You can see them in the middle of the bottom register right there. But in this instance, they're scaled down so that the swords stay within the register. Both of these elements make the swords breaking through the register just seem a little bit more significant. Reading these figures as sword tumblers, though, is really supported by an incomplete Hittite text, which reads, the acrobats be turn or pivot on a sword. Every time I've seen that text cited, it's cited with a lot of confusion, but in the context of these depictions, it seems possible or probable that what is being described is sword tumbling. This is also supported by an unprovenance Hittite seal, which shows a figure bent backwards over a sword in the center image. I'm not going to talk through the Tel Brock seal in quite as much detail, but I do want to quickly point out that there are these spikes. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but if you can, there are these spikes here right underneath the backbending figures, which I am inclined to read as swords as well. The last thing I want to mention is that there is one Bronze Age object that's been previously interpreted as a sword tumbler, which is this gold sword pommel from Crete on the far right. It has a figure that's wrapped around the hilt of the sword. But you can see that from the drawing, it's displayed with that this has been taken to represent a figure arched over a sword, and it's also been discussed as a sword tumbler in publications. It's difficult to apply some of the specific theoretical concerns, especially those focused on movement and performance choices, because the evidence available only gives us this really brief snapshot of the performance and one that's been filtered at minimum through an artist or a scribe. Even though it's hard to construct exactly what these performances might have looked like, understanding them as embodied experiences that convey meaning helps us think more fully about the function of these performances. If we accept my argument that the objects I discussed are showing hupu performers and that these performances are sword tumbling, then we need to consider the use of the sword as an especially important component of these performances and the way in which we can understand how they are embodied. It indicates that the performers accentuated both the real and perceived danger of their movements. This curation of danger is important in thinking about what effects these performances might have had. An audience's perception of a performer's body in danger affects how they experience a performance. This is something probably most people have experienced. We have embodied reactions like holding our breath, tensing up, or having a raised heart rate in response to watching something we feel is dangerous. Sometimes audiences might even do things like collectively gasp during a heightened moment, or we breathe a sigh of relief when the danger has passed. This audience response to a performing body is something that performance theorist Peta Tate calls reciprocating bodily awareness. And Jonathan Vickers, who wrote a dissertation on acrobatic performance in ancient Greece, calls it kinesthetic empathy, which is the term that I'll use here. In this case of sword tumbling, the inclusion of the sword in the performance most likely adds a sense of danger that would have likely produced a visceral response in observers. The acrobat's body moving over the sword might produce a range of messages and types of kinesthetic empathy for the audience. Fear when the acrobat is in the most danger, to relief when they successfully complete the skill. And of course, the sword likely carries additional meanings and significance as well. The setting of these performances at feasts and in festivals might suggest that the sense of danger and the kinesthetic empathy it gave rise to was used to contribute to the atmosphere of these events, adding to the collective embodied experience among the audience. Feasts are already spaces where groups share food, drink, and emotions. They're places that produce what Yanis Hamalakis calls synchronicity. Without text telling us explicitly about the audience's reaction to the performances, it's hard to say for certain how people might have experienced them. When trying to tease this out, though, the physical movements used in the performance and the audience experience of the performance can't be extricated from each other. The semiotics here are fundamentally built on and into the embodied experience of the performers and audience. In the case study I presented, I've suggested that the emphasis on danger and the subsequent kinesthetic empathy is a key part in understanding the role of this performance. There are many other elements of performance that we could use to further understand what these performances were and their meanings, things like costuming and dress, the physical setting of the performance, the time of day it occurred, who precisely was in attendance, how the performers were situated relative to them, etc. All of these elements are ways in which performances create meaning. There's a lot more work to be done in exploring this category of hoopoo performer, and I plan to continue working with this material, but it's been really exciting to think about the role of dangerous and extreme movement, the ways in which semiotics and kinesthetics are enmeshed, and the permeability of the boundary between performer and audience. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much.